This is a very special episode. This is trimmed from videos that appeared on my Patreon, so you have those folks to thank. We were detailing a very special project. Survey the wasteland. It's a big project. Here it is. It's in great shape. You know what this is? Or was? I believe it began life as a double cutaway Les Paul Jr. from, I believe, 1959, which is a great year for Gibsons. When we're done, it'll have the appearance of a Gibson once again. But if we're honest, I think it's going to be mostly my work. It's like the old tale of the guy who says, "This is my grandfather's hammer. The handle broke, so my dad had to replace it, and then I put on a different head, but it's still my grandfather's hammer." You know, at what point does it stop being a Gibson? It is very definitely a Gibson neck. Brazilian board. No frets to speak of at this point. They're very, very low. What's left of the headstock? It obviously had some replacement tuners, probably Grovers, in the 1970s. There are indentations from a larger washer, and the holes have been reamed out to fit the larger barrel size. It's actually pretty common. And would you believe it hasn't had a headstock break? Not that I can see, although it's hard to tell under this stellar paint job. Like, where did these black spots come from? The headstock overlay is gone, and the thickness is slightly reduced, such that this socket adapter that someone has managed to get wedged on the nut and left in place is proud of the surface. There is no nut. That's a vintage Gibson strap button. Seems to be a homemade replacement jack plate there, out of some super heavy gauge white plastic, held in place with Robertson panhead screws, which themselves are kind of an anomaly because they seem like they're like number 8s, but they've got the tiny little number 1 drive. The Robertson green. Never seen that before. Interesting. Let's look at what's left of the body. Before the fresh paint job, it seems like the body was pretty heavily sanded to a depth below the pore filler that Gibson would have used. As I can see these striations from the grain all over it. There's a kind of a red plug looking thing there too, which is irregular in its surface. I'm certain this was originally a single pickup junior. It wasn't like a special with 2 pickups, because the original control cavity is still intact and there's just room for 2 pots back here. 1 volume, 1 tone. No switch. And rather than the single dog ear P90, someone decided it should have 2 humbuckers. See the quality of the craftsmanship. We're all aware that much of the celebrated Gibson tone and sustain comes from their set neck design, but who's to say you can't have the best of both worlds by putting some screws in there? Here's a rather odd situation. Looking at the bushings here for the bridge, which is the typical wrap tailpiece style bridge, these bushings have been pushed right down into the holes. They took a page from Fender and introduced a comfort armrest bevel into the body. So, is it worth it? Most people would contend, no, it's too far gone. Except for the fact that these things are now worth a bunch of money. When all of this was accomplished, you could probably pick one up for $750. Now, even heavily refinished, repaired, messed around with versions of this guitar actually make decent money. And I can bring this back to the point where it's profitable. So, yeah, when we're done, it's going to be a TV yellow, late 50s double cut junior. And someone's going to buy it. I won't be able to pass it off as a pristine example, but it'll be playable, and it will have a 1950s neck, and some of the body will be original 1950s mahogany. We'll get into the stripping process, and I also answered a few questions that viewers had asked. Quite a number of people actually wanted to know what I'm going to do about this. How am I actually going to tackle this issue with so much missing wood? And the answer is I'm just going to plug it. I'm going to make a routing template and cut out large portions of the missing material here to create myself nice, firm outlines, and then I'm going to make wooden plugs that fit tightly in there. Yeah. I mean, this area here is pretty much unsalvageable. It's got cracks, and so much material is missing. I want to get rid of, basically, this recess here, and this one was routed for a much wider humbucker. So, you know, that's all going to be one big piece of wood that slides right in there. And this part here is just basically going to be a mahogany cap that's inset. So, I mean, I might even leave it chambered for kicks. We'll see. For neatness sake, I'm going to tape off this fretboard. Paul Fast mentions that he has an early 60s SG Junior. Those guitars were bound, and someone did a refinish on that in the 70s, but the stripper caused the binding to deform and melt, and portions of it are now missing. He was wondering if I know of any good resources for learning the right way to redo it, or if I plan on doing it. In this case, I can't because there is no binding on here. That's the thing with chemical strippers and old celluloid binding. You just tend to melt it, right? You know, it's hot stuff. If a neck is missing big chunks of binding, it's probably best to pull it all off and just start from fresh and glue new binding on, which may or may not require a refret at the same time, right? Because if it's a Gibson that's got nibs on the fret ends where the binding comes up, you could, you know, try and refashion those. But if it's like this where the ends of the frets come over the binding, then, you know, it's just quicker and easier and cleaner to pull the frets, bind it, and then refret it, you know, which is kind of probably what it needs at this point anyway. I do have a Les Paul video that I made a couple years back where I show how annoying that can get. Because in the 90s, Gibson went to a binding that had a little tab cut on it that fit into a groove that was machined into the side of the neck. So they keyed into each other. Those are a little bit more difficult to deal with ones from the 60s, where it's usually just a straight slab of binding into like a rectangular recess cut along a channel for it to fit in. But rebinding is really one of the most messy and annoying jobs you can do. So I'm going to be using some super remover. New generation stripper for paint and varnish. The strongest stripper without methylene chloride. Safe on wood, concrete, and metals. There are a number of different... I don't know what this was finished with. I think it may be like an enamel out of a rattle can. Hard to say. It seems to have been sprayed. Stripping old guitars is kind of hit and miss, depending on when they were made and with what material they were finished in. Basically, all of the really old vintage ones with nitro lacquer or shellac and that kind of thing, those are pretty easy. Virtually any stripper will work. When you get into the 1970s and beyond, you start seeing polyurethane finishes or various acrylic type lacquers. Those can be very difficult because the strippers really just don't penetrate them. And you probably the best way to strip those is to use a heat gun, which is a hateful task because you're there all day. You basically warm it up enough that you can slip a palette knife under it and just sort of peel it up, which is, like I say, no fun. This stuff here, I'm just going to apply some of the stripper and a piece of wax paper here. This could also be plastic wrap or something, and that'll slow down the evaporation and give it some extra time to sink into the finish and work its way down. More active time, basically. So let that sit for 20 minutes. We'll come back and start scraping. Okay, it's been 20 minutes. Longer is usually better, of course. Let's see what's coming up. It often takes multiple applications to get anywhere. it seems like there might be a clear finish on top, which is starting to come away. Jay Thorne asks if there's anything that could be done with the finish that doesn't require stripping, and I would say no. Not unless you wanted to paint over it again. I mean, this is not the original finish. It does not look like an original finish, and it was kind of nasty, right? So you could, you know, fill it and then paint another coat or two over top. There was an artist, or I guess he's still an artist, Eric Cameron, who since the 70s he's been producing what he calls thick paintings, where he takes objects and he paints a layer of gesso on them. Gesso is a sort of, it's like a primer, and he paints over them over and over, thousands of coats, and they eventually become these sort of bizarro sculptural things that look nothing like what they started off with. Kind of disturbing. So that's always an option. Something really interesting coming up here. Let's have a look. There are a series of holes in this rather large divot, round hole, right in the center of the guitar. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Something was applied there. Some kind of applique. It doesn't look like any vibrato system I'm familiar with. So it's coming along. I think just for kicks, I'm going to try using a heat gun on the back here in an area to see if that's quicker, easier, or perhaps less toxic. You really do have to be careful with this. You can get this thing hot enough that it could burst into flame. So yeah, that's an expensive hobby in terms of electricity cost. It's, I'm not sure it's that much more efficient than just using a scraper and scraping through. Maybe a bit. I think that might come in handy on the neck area where I'm dealing with the radius surface. Might be a little bit easier. I need to try and get this makeshift truss rod nut off the guitar. So I'll saturate it with some penetrating oil. This thing, I don't know what it started life as, something like a cap nut or something, but it was modified with a slot so that you could use a standard slotted screwdriver to turn it. It's quite difficult, and there's not a whole lot of material there, and if I'm not careful, I will strip it out completely, and then that would be a whole lot of mess. So I'm being pretty careful, but I did manage to back it out and take it off the guitar. There was quite a buildup of drippy, chippy, and gooey paint built up around the rod and the whole access channel, so I took a carving gouge and scraped most of it out of there. I kind of want to take the neck off the body at this point. Not a particularly easy thing to do at the best of times, however this has also been messed with before, so who knows. I'm going to drill some holes along the edge of the tenon to its depth, basically, and I'll have a place to put in my heat probes. So I'm just drilling the holes here. There were several cross braces fitted in the area of the neck to body joint, none of which seemed to be especially useful, so I'll saw through those and down to the tenon area. So much material was removed from the neck tenon, and a good many screws were introduced from the back, so I'm not actually sure how thick the material there actually is at the bottom, but I should try and take it out in one piece just to see. In go my foam cutters. And we'll turn those on and see what happens. I'll supplement the heat with my iron laid directly on the body because I don't have any finish to worry about. The heat on it is set low enough that I don't actually have to worry about scorching the wood. I think it's around 180 degrees Fahrenheit. The neck, as it was fit into the pocket, was not particularly accurate, and there is a bit of a gap in which I can get my palette knife and start working it back and forth as things heat up and get juicy. The components are wiggling, but not yet ready to come free. More prying and levering. And I drove my knife into the cracks between the tenon and the body, just to make sure that everything was separated. Still no luck, so I tacked this side with the heat gun right down into the pocket. The whole thing moved in a strange fashion. It's like the tenon felt too whippy in places, making me wonder what was going on. I wasn't really going for brute force, but at a certain point I recognized that this thing was so messed up that I was going to have to reconstruct it anyway, and there wasn't a whole lot left to save, so let's do this, shall we? Yes, just like that. Nice. Yeah, this there are a number of layers of wood in here from past attempts to get the angle right. It's a thing of beauty. Looking closely, I also note that there was a crack which ran through the heel and into the tenon too. I'll pare away some of the obvious additions and get back to original wood. Like, I don't even understand how it managed to get to the state it was. I figure I'm going to actually have to cut most of this away to make it functional. So I ended up sawing it off right at the end of the tenon where it meets the bulk of the neck. I'll plane off the end of the heel, both to reduce the thickness of the neck at that point so I have room to glue something onto it, and also to get beyond some of the damage there. There is, of course, a layer of laminated wood on top of it, some screw holes and some associated weirdness. I'll also true up the end of the neck, trying to make that fairly perpendicular with the front face of the fingerboard and straight across. Sometimes a sanding block is more expedient, and this being end grain, it's not the easiest thing to plane. This little activity here throws the high spots into high relief, and I'll know where to plane down to. I'll keep track of progress with a straight edge. I measured and scribed a line to plane down to. I'm also in the process of making a number of routing templates because, as I mentioned, there are vast areas of missing mahogany that will have to be filled. To sand the end of the heel into perpendicularity with the end of the neck, I made a little right angle sanding block, which is a much easier process. I have to be careful not to rock it back and forth and inadvertently sand a curve into the thing, which would be very difficult to glue a new piece of wood onto. I'll get rid of the coarse sanding scratches with a smooth file, and I'll also try and make the center of the heel just slightly concave so that the edges of the heel will be contacting the new piece of wood, and it's like 1/1000th of an inch, very small hollow, but I want the outside touching first and getting clamped down in the center, so there won't be any gaps. It produces the tightest fit. So I cut this mating piece of mahogany, which will get glued in place, and that'll create a full depth tenon like it would have originally had. I'll use an extra generous coating of glue on the end grain surfaces, as that stuff just soaks it right up. It's not going to be the strongest bond, of course, but I intend to reinforce it with some hidden dowels as well. Got it all clamped firmly into place. I've got some 3/8 of an inch hard maple dowel, which I'm going to sink all the way through the new block and into the end of the heel.
I drilled it in a series of passes because it's a long, deep hole. One thing about trying to sink a long dowel into a deep hole is there can be a kind of hydraulic lock that happens with the glue, which will prevent you from sinking it all the way in. So it's a good idea to use a little carving V-tool here and make a couple of relief cuts to get some air down there and allow it to evacuate while you're pushing it in. Glue should go in the hole rather than on the dowel so it doesn't all get scraped off by the edge of the hole as it's being inserted. Now then, time to plug up the carnage. I'm going to start with the deepest plug first, which is this one, which takes up a good chunk of the front of the guitar, and it's quite deep, of course. Made up the template here. I'm going to tape and super glue this in place. Just a really secure and reliable way to hold the two things together, because there's going to be a lot of routing. To do this kind of routing, you need a whole series of lengths of pattern router bits to accommodate just the amount of material you have to remove. The thing is, you don't want to try and take too much off at any one pass. The first cut's only about 3/16 of an inch deep. For the last few passes, I need to use this monster, which is a full 1.5 inches long, like 38 millimeters. This is a bit you can order online, but most domestic retailers don't sell in brick and mortar stores because of the liability. In the wrong hands, these are an accident waiting to happen, because they've got that thin 1/4 inch 6 millimeter shaft diameter. There's great potential for bending them if you happen to slam it into the wall of whatever you're routing. And also that huge length of blade contacting all at once creates a huge amount of drag, so the router tends to jump in unpredictable ways. It's not for the beginner. Here is the maximum depth of cut I would take with that bit, just so you get some feel for it. The whole process is really the better part of an hour, grinding away incrementally. It's a bit stressful. I took it down to about 39 millimeters deep. Then I have to plane the insert piece to the appropriate width. This is something I have to sneak up on too because I want a good fit. Have a listen to this. I'll mark the 1/2 inch radius on the outside corners. I'll get that fit in, and then we'll see you guys next time. Back at it here. At this point I'm still patching holes. I've got a rather large and intricate patch to do around where the electronics area was. So I've made a tracing of the side of the guitar, and I'm going to use that to come up with something that will be sort of aesthetically pleasing. Not that you'll ever see it, but I don't know. It seemed like the thing to do. I also have to get rid of this comfort arm bevel, which is anachronistic. Actually, it's probably a good addition. It was the one thing that was done right, but we still have to get rid of it because I'm aiming for something that's close to factory appearance. I'll route that off. This has to happen in multiple passes as it's a pretty deep bevel. It's a chunk of mahogany, African mahogany, and I'll square that up. I'll glue that in place. Get it clamped up with multiple clamps. Here I'm just shaping the electronics cavity plug. It'll fit nicely and snug in the template. I glued in the main plug that runs down the center of the body, and here I'm using a pattern making bit with a top-mounted bearing to square that up with the outline. Then I'll switch to a bottom-mounted bearing to do the armrest area. Then it's on to a hand plane to flush that up with the rest of the surface. With the electronics template in place, I'll go and route that out. I've decided I'm going to leave most of this cavity empty. It's going to be chambered, so it's going to be even lighter than your average Les Paul Jr. So I'm routing a ledge that will allow for 1/4 inch thickness, which is fine for supporting the pots. And it'll also leave a space in there for me to run wires. So that should fit in there pretty snugly. And that too needs to be planed. There's a whole lot of routing in a project like this. Maybe there are people in the world who find that fascinating and fun, but for me it's just like a whole lot of mess and noise, and I much prefer to use hand tools when possible. There are some screw holes that need plugging, so I'll make them more regular using a Forstner bit. Little glue, little face grain plug. I'll saw those flush with a flush cutting saw. The recess for the control plate cover is still clogged with paint. There are several layers. At one time it seems to have been painted black. I'm cleaning up the face of the headstock. Here I'm using a smooth file, which helps me work around the end of the truss rod. And it also helps to maintain something close to flatness. I also use a sanding block. At the end of the heel I have to blend in my new wood with the old. To flatten the surfaces of the guitar, I've got some 100 grit sandpaper stuck down to a big flat board. I'm just going to rub it. There's a lot of rubbing to do. I'll make a new headstock overlay with some black dyed veneer. Some trimming needs to take place. As is usually the case, there will be places along the top of the crest which have been rubbed and or broken off, so there's not going to be perfect contact between the veneer and the mahogany there, and I'll have to do some filling. It's time to smooth the body outline with the oscillating spindle sander and a disc sander for the outside curves. Then the palm sander takes over. Here's a 1/2 inch radius roundover bit. It's good for most of the outline except for when you reach the area around the jack cavity. Could create a great big divot if you're not careful. It's best practice to start at the top or widest portions and then go downhill with the grain. There are a whole lot of areas that need some putty and some hand sanding. I have to derive a center line, which isn't the easiest thing when there isn't a center seam. I'm going to be replacing the old bridge inserts. I'm going to go with some Tone Pros locking studs. These are kind of a puzzle. They've been pushed down, way down inside, and they seem short, which is a genuine mystery to me. For the first few years of production, until 1957, Gibson used short threaded inserts, only about 1/2 inch long. The holes that they went into were drilled for like 1 inch insert though. It's been surmised that maybe they ordered the wrong part and just used it up until they were all gone and then switched to the right one. But these short inserts caused problems because they weren't long enough to really deal with the tension, and they allowed the studs to lean forward over time. They tend to crush the wood around the top of the hole here, so you end up with a bridge that's tilted quite dramatically. But in 1957, they switched over, started using 1 inch long inserts. Now this guitar probably shouldn't have short inserts. The double cutaway was introduced in 1958, after the change. I can't explain this. But then again, enough things have been fooled with on this guitar that I suppose anything's possible. But I will have to take these out at some point and put the new ones in. I do want to check and see how the bridge lines up with the center line that I've made for myself. So let's install that. We can talk about the bridges too. These are another feature on vintage Juniors that didn't quite make the mark right out of the gate. These are a wrap style bridge, so the strings go through the body and over the top. But for some reason, Gibson decided to angle the stud placement in sort of an extreme way, such that none of them really intonate in a truly satisfying manner. The bridges are slightly adjustable with a couple of set screws that run through the body here. The body on these bridges is aluminum, the screws are steel, and people often strip out the bridges by trying to adjust them while they're under string tension. Don't do that. But the placement of the post here for the treble side is a little too far forward, such that you run out of room, and this is kind of normal. So you'll have the adjustment set screw all the way in as far as it'll go, and only the front, 3/32 of an inch is actually gripped by the stud. There's a big space there. It looks weird and it's not very strong. So then enter the good people at Music City Bridge in Nashville. Joe Glazer's the repair guru there. They are producing some aftermarket bridges of various profiles for Juniors of different eras. This is the one they call the Stud Finder, which is designed specifically for these guitars, 54 to 61. And you can see it's got this elongated claw on the treble side. Looks sort of like a lobster. It's got the pinchy claw and the crusher claw. It also has a string takeoff line that's designed to intonate properly with these. And it's a little more positive than the simple rounded profile of the originals. You can sometimes get sort of a sitar-like buzz and weird harmonics out of them from the round profile. These things are not cheap, but I figure if I'm going to do all of this work on this thing, it should at least play in tune. And I've used these before with good success. So this is how it ends up looking, It's not exactly like vintage, but most people who play these things would never take them off after they put them on. I've also secured a Gibson noiseless P90. Single coil P90 is not a quiet pickup. They tend to buzz quite a bit, and combating that can be a real challenge in some of the venues around here that have exceptionally loud house wiring. So this should help out a bit. I will need to plot its placement and route for that. These bridges are also designed to allow the strings to come up and over and end up centered on the neck in the way that the originals often don't. So this might actually change my center line again just a little bit. Now then, I have to situate the pickup. And to do that I have to kind of conspire with the pick guard to see what I can get away with. In the original Juniors, the pickup was very close to the treble stud here, and that leaning effect we were talking about usually caused a crack right through into the pickup cavity, which is unsightly and kind of dangerous. In I think 1957 they moved it forward some to strengthen that area up. To remove the old bushings, I use a spare stud paired with a riser block and a washer. It gently pulls them out. Looks like I'm going to need a taller spacer. The amazing thing was, this is an original full-length bushing. It had just been pushed down deep below the surface for some reason. So I used some fine sandpaper and cleaned off the surface rust and excess paint. There's a remnant in the bottom there of the original ground wire. I made up a routing template. P90s should all be the same size, but sometimes they aren't. So I almost always end up making a fresh one. I'll glue that in place, and I'll route out the cavity in multiple passes as usual. I'll drill for a new ground wire. In this case I'm going from the pickup cavity. It just seemed a cleaner, easier way to get them all together. The end of this wire has been stripped, and that's what's going to make contact with the bushing and thereby ground the bridge and the strings. It's good to test for continuity. Here comes an exacting and challenging part of the process. I have to get this neck on straight, but also in a place where intonation is possible, because the bridge position is already set, There's some adjustability there, but not much, so this neck has to go on in the right place. So, as luck would have it, we are kind of where we should be. The end of the fingerboard is lining up right with the end of the body. I'm just guesstimating my string path with a piece of taut thread. This design, with 22 frets free of the body and the end of the neck lining up with the edge, is kind of crazy. It does give you fantastic access, but when you're talking about the dual pickup version of this guitar, one with a neck pickup, it's absolutely negligent on Gibson's part. It's about as risky a neck attachment as ever been tried. It never should have been done. And the fact that it was carried over into the early SG models is also crazy. It lasted like 3 years, because it's doomed to crack. They were relying on a tenon that had most of its thickness cut away to make room for the pickup. And the fact that any of those guitars survived is kind of remarkable. Most of them have been repaired, even the very cleanest examples, because the necks were super floppy and they all break. The single pickup models like this, no problem. This is rock solid. The shape of the pickguard was most likely designed to hide this long tenon here. A lot of these are really quite rough. When you take the pickguards off, they've got big voids and gaps near the end. Because again, it's a student model guitar. There's no time for refinement. They just sort of chopped it with a chisel and got it to shape. I've left the end of the heel rough at this point and uncarved, and actually a little bit too long, because I can refine it after I've got it planed to the correct angle to the body. That's the other thing. We have essentially a non-adjustable pickup height. There's a little bit in the screws. I could use shims, but I don't really want to. And I'd like the strings to be a specific height above the pickup, where the bridge is not sitting too high or too low, and there's still a little bit of adjustability to it. It's kind of daunting, You don't get... If you go wrong, you've gone really wrong. In trying to determine the optimal height for my bridge, I've got to take into account the thickness of the fretboard, which sits proud of the surface of the guitar, plus the thickness of the frets and the eventual action, and balance that with a gap above the pickup screws, which I'm going to want to be probably in the range of a 1/16 to 3/32 of an inch, 1.5 to 1.7 millimeters. And once I've got those two figured out, I'm assuming I'm going to have about 8 millimeters string height. I can set the bridge so that those two end up being optimal, and this is the height the bridge should be for my figuring out what the neck angle is going to be. I'm gluing on some router guides. I want this a good snug fit. It shouldn't be loose at this point. More routing. I only deepen the recess by about 4 millimeters at a time, so it takes multiple passes. There we go. That's to full depth. I'll chisel the radius on both corners. Wouldn't you know it? I somehow neglected to film myself planing the underside of the tenon to the correct angle. I refined the fit till it was good and snug. Now that I know where the end of the body is, I can refine the shape and make it look the way I want it to. For some reason, the final fret marker had fallen out, so I'll re-drill the hole, pop in a piece of plastic, shave it off. I'll glue the neck on. I'll re-expose the truss rod cavity. Because I planed an angle on the underside of the heel, I have to cut off the corresponding wedge of material which is sticking up above the surface of the guitar. The tuner holes are way too big and misshapen. I'll have to plug these. I'll do several rounds of pore filling with this Aqua Coat. This is a water-based pore filler. I've been using it for several years, but I'm not sure I really like it. I don't know. It kind of functions okay, but the shrink back is more than I'd like, And I'll probably end up experimenting with some of these surfboard epoxies that other people are using to do epoxy fills. I've tried epoxy filling before with 5-minute epoxy, which was a bit of a hassle.
Finish. Let's talk about it. We're making this into a TV model. Some history about the nomenclature there. Today we speak of TV yellow as an actual Gibson color choice. It's not always been the case. Originally, these things, as they were produced in the 1950s, were finished in something called limed mahogany. And that's a very mid-century modern color choice. It's a semi-transparent, light, kind of creamy blonde tone that, well, it's not unlike the one we see on Fender Telecasters from the second half of the 50s. You know, that light, almost whitish color? This was all the rage at the time. You know, lots of home furnishings were finished that way. You could go to Sears, you picked up your boomerang-shaped coffee table. It was one of the color options. And TV cabinets too, for that matter. The thing is, whatever lacquer Gibson used shifted tone into the yellow category pretty quickly. You can see pictures from the 1960s and the instruments have already changed color, and they look basically the same as they do now. There also seems to be significant variation from batch to batch, depending on who was mixing the color and spraying. And in addition, there are many that have a clear coat on top of the color layers, but not always. And that clear coat can go very amber over time. True Vintage Guitar sold an example a year or two ago that seems to have been completely original, and somehow it must have been kept in like an argon-filled case or something, because it has not yellowed at all. It's the whitest looking Junior that anyone's ever seen, to the extent that it actually looks wrong. You know, it doesn't seem right, but it is. So there's lots of choice where color is concerned. I've sprayed on a couple of coats of a pre-mixed formula from our friends at Oxford Finishing, and their TV yellow looks good, but to me it looks like it's close to new. You know, I don't mind some residual dings or sinkage from all the stuff that's happened to it, but I think I might try and put some weather checking on it. I think I'm going to go ahead and spray a coat of light amber on this to shift us down a notch into sort of the school bus territory rather than canary yellow. And then I'm going to put on 5 or 6 coats of clear lacquer. I lucked out. It's a really nice day outside, so I'm going to do that this afternoon.
I got a nice water slide decal set from our friends at, I believe it's Crow Guitars, C-R-O-X Guitars in the UK. They behave nicely. They look the part. They're period accurate. You want to be pretty gentle with these things. I've got to spray lacquer over top of them. After they've had a chance to dry, of course. Got to make a nut. Originally, they would have been nylon. I'm using bone.
I thought I was making a new nut, but I'm just looking at these frets. And you know what? No. These things are only about 27 thousandths of an inch tall. I want them taller than that. So I gotta pull these out and put new ones in.
I didn't go crazy on the dressing. I left some wear marks in the rosewood.
Yeah, just looking at the original wire here, and I can tell this is a wider wire. And that definitely suggests, again, this is a 1959. Because prior to then they were using the skinny, super sort of vintage wire, which is around 80 thousandths or less. And this is more like 94 thousandths, it seems like. 93, 94. So, based on the size of the neck and that wire, I'm thinking 59. If the neck was skinnier with this wire, it would probably be 1960. So, again, that's pretty cool. So I think I'll go with the Stuart McDonald number 141 wire, which is approximately the same width as the original. It'll be taller than the original frets, though, slightly, which most players seem to prefer, but it will look at home. One little piece of information I don't drag out very often when I'm doing this, but I probably should. Something I got from Dan Earlywine, who did some testing, I believe, with a friend about this a long time ago. When you take fret wire, standard 18% nickel silver wire, and run it through a fret roller, you are very slightly work hardening it. And if you do a bunch of passes and continually roll it, it's getting harder and harder, which has the effect of making the wire more durable. You can't change it into stainless steel, obviously, but you can take the standard wire and make it behave like a harder wire. So rather than going for it in one fell swoop, I like to sneak up on it in a whole bunch of passes.
Fretting proceeds as usual. A little glue in the slot, pre-bent wire, knock in the ends, couple taps in the center, wipe off excess glue so it doesn't end up on my fret press, grab my fret press, give it a squeeze. It's not easy to find a template for one of these pick guards if you don't happen to have one at hand. So I actually derived this by finding a picture online of a vintage example and blowing it up to the correct size on my computer monitor and tracing it. Using that method, there will always be some slight adjustment necessary, but I came pretty close. I made this out of 2mm thick tortoise plastic, which is actually really thin in comparison to the originals. They're almost comically thick. I don't know the exact dimension, but it might be close to 1/4 of an inch. And they tend to look kind of funny, to my eye anyway. Lots of frets on this model. I'll do some wet sanding with 600 grit to get rid of this orange peel surface and buff it out with some rubbing compound. I decided to do some relicing. It's not often I get the chance to, so I might as well. Give it some bonks. I'll do some buckle wear, places where the case would have bumped up against the edges. Some scratches, some dents, some dings. Now, this is kind of fun. I'm using canned keyboard duster, which is like very expensive compressed air. The thing is, if you invert the can, the propellant comes out and it's very cold. It frosts up immediately and contracts the lacquer, like instantly, causing little crazed lines that are similar to the checking we get caused by age. So I'll go over the whole instrument and freeze it up. This is the result. It's not bad. It's not identical to what you'll see in old instruments. If you've seen enough of them, you probably pick it out, but it's a good effect. I'll ream the potholes to size. It's a pretty simple harness, 50s spec, and it fits in there nicely. I'll press in the new tuner bushings. I got some Kluson single line deluxe, which are the correct model. To avoid any misunderstanding, I made up a little repair label that'll go on the inside of the electronics cover describing what this thing is. Time to level the frets. Oh, we're getting close now. Recrowning, followed by polishing. I did some work on the nut.
Well, all right. It's the end of a very long adventure. Thanks for hanging in with me. There will be those extremely astute and important individuals who will point out that this isn't worth it, and other poisonous things. Let's put it in perspective. An original TV Model Junior from 1959 is a guitar worth between $15,000 and $20,000 Canadian dollars. This, when it was acquired, was worth considerably less than that. I mean, it didn't even have a single part worth scavenging on it. And it's only by dint of human effort that it could ever be made to play music again. And no, it's not worth $15,000 now. But it does have about $800 worth of top quality parts and hardware and materials in it. That's even before talking about the labor involved. You could buy a brand new Gibson-made Les Paul Jr. for about $2,000. If you wanted a custom shop Murphy Lab cosmetically aged like this one, More like $8,000. Again, Canadian dollars. So I reckon this has got to be worth somewhere in between those two figures. Remember, this was around at the end of the 50s. Chunks of it were probably sister cuts from the same log that produced the bodies of all those 1959 bursts that we know and love. If you've ever seen native Hondurans making a dugout canoe from a mahogany tree, you know that they're like 8 feet wide across at the base and, 40 feet long. And there's enough material to keep Gibson busy for several months if we're in the 1950s. But anyway, sometimes you just gotta do stuff. And this felt like one of those times. So we shall plug it in and make some noise.
So this guitar is now for sale via my friend Alfie Smith. I'll leave a link in the video description if it interests you. If the link is gone, it's obviously been sold and you are out of luck. And of course, we should say a hearty thank you to all of my Patreon subscribers. It's their help that lets me make all of those 20-minute videos without having to put ads in the middle of them, which is annoying for both you and me. And as always, thank you for watching.